I want to have this session very much focused on how we bridge the gap between formal learning and the rest of the world where stuff actually happens. So we'll talk a little bit about some of the theory, some of the background, some of the ideas, share with you some of the case studies, some of the things that I'm doing at the moment with some different organisations around the world, just to try to illustrate how we can practically implement some of these ideas. Because it's about being effective. This is really at the heart of it, what learning is about. It turns out it's not about being employed to do learning. It's about helping people to be more effective. In fact, I think the whole notion of learning being a thing that we do is gradually being eroded into this notion of continual performance support, about helping people to be excellent, to be effective, to be purposeful in the moment, getting the right information to people at the right time to enable them to do their job. The learning that we used to do in organisations was formal and abstract and defined by time and place, which was okay. You know, we could deliver great quality experiences, we could make people feel good about it, we could test them at the end of it, and it was nice and constrained and confined. But then they went out and hit the real world. It was very difficult to bridge that gap, to get from the learning into performance. Social learning is inherently about supporting people in the moment. It's co-created, community facilitated, technology facilitated, but it's very much about being effective, and then being effective again. It's about being agile, which is about solving problems through an ability to make sense of it, to figure it out with your community, to get access to information, access to knowledge, and do something with that. It's not about system and process, it's about mindset. We want people to be effective. Has anybody been to Austin? Austin, Texas. Yes, we were on Austin last week. Was it last week? I lose track. I got me a Stetson, which is great. I'm not a hat person. It's the first hat I've ever owned. So I was thinking about Austin, because I hadn't been before. So when we first find out about something, when we first hear about something, we have to make sense of it. We have to create the frames that we're going to understand it within. We can call these any number of terms we like, the knowledge schemas, the scaffolding around an idea. When you first hear about genetics, you have to figure out how does that work, what's it broadly about, then burrow down to detail. That's basically how we learn stuff. We get the initial idea and we position it against our broad field of knowledge, and then we start to delve down into it. And the further we delve into it, the more we think, I get that bit, I don't get that, I agree with that, I don't agree with that. But you know, here's Austin. This is Austin. David Kelly over in the e-learning guild said, come to Austin. So I thought, what do I know about Austin? Well, the first thing I rely on is, of course, my stereotypes, because I've heard of Austin before. So I've seen it in films. Dallas, I saw Dallas on TV. That was in Texas, wasn't it? It's all Stetsons and oil rigs and cowboys. You know, I have to rely on, I bought some cowboy boots as well, but I'm not going to wear those today. We rely on our stereotypes. These are what gives us our broad contextual positioning knowledge, but then we reach out. We reach out to other types of knowledge. And the interesting thing in the social age is that not all of these are formal. So Austin has a website. There's a city tourism website, and it tells you a little bit about that broad positioning. There's a downtown area. There's a South Congress, which is like the arty hippie area. There's the Riverside Walks. It breaks it down into these broad sweeps. But it is, of course, formal. And some of the places that are mentioned on that Austin website, I suspect, pay to be there. They're certainly the sort of key tourist sites. But there's also Wikipedia. And Wikipedia is, of course, co-created and co-owned. So it's created by the community. It's democratized entirely. It was my birthday yesterday, and I was feeling a bit grumpy because I was jet-lagged and in London by myself. And one of my friends cooked for me, and she works at Nature, the magazine. There's an interesting piece of research out last year about the journal Nature, which is the height of peer-reviewed Western scientific methodology, comparing it to Wikipedia against 42 hard science subjects. This is Wikipedia, of course, which was banned by the universities because it wasn't valid. It wasn't considered reliable enough to be used, to be referenced. So across 42 hard science subjects, Wikipedia had 3 serious factual errors, and Nature had 2 serious factual errors. It's pretty close. And they both had somewhere around 150, 160 minor factual errors. So in a short space of time, Wikipedia as a technology to capture tacit knowledge, to capture community knowledge, has emerged, has been dreadful, has got itself to pretty good. pretty fast, and it will continue to get better. So these established schemas of authority and knowledge are continuing to evolve, but we're often seeing a democratization of where the knowledge lies, of how it's held. So I can reach out anyway. I can reach out to official websites, I can reach to Wikipedia, but I can also reach out to Sam, who's my next door neighbour, who's just back from Austin. So that's probably more reliable. It's contemporary, plus he has a reputation. I know he's travelled a lot. So if he tells me somewhere's good, it's probably good. If my dad tells me about something in Austin, he's not been to Austin. In fact, he's not been to America, so I'm probably not going to give it as much credibility, because he's probably relying on his stereotypes. And then, of course, when I land in Austin, I need to find out what to do, and then I can start to draw on the technology more. So assuming I've got my local SIM in place, I've got my free data, I've got my free Wi-Fi, I can use Google Maps. I'm playing with my Apple Watch, which is cool. I like my Apple Watch. Has anybody got an Apple Watch? Can I send you my heartbeat? Because the only other person I found that had one was the huge black security guy at JFK, and I wasn't going to send him my heartbeats. So we've got the technology, but of course the technology facilitates different things. Who's used Uber? Yeah, we use Uber. And the reason we use Uber is because it's come along through ignorance or good intention and broken the model of the taxi industry. And I talked to some of the people, the taxi drivers, complaining about Uber, and they're entirely missing the point. It's not about Uber. It's about the fact that the fundamental model on which that industry was built is broken. It's like the hotel industry, who believed that you had to have a hotel to be in the hotel industry. But there are more Airbnb bed spaces in the world than there are hotel spaces now in 4 years. It's broken the model because things are different. The technology connects us. And what we want as consumers is the utility. So I just want to get from A to B easily. And that's what Uber gives me. And then, of course, when I'm there, I can capture information and I can share it. I can narrate my story. And that's the other thing that technology does. And this is, how we live our lives. It's in a web of information, of formal sources of information, of co-created social sources. We curate content, we share content, and it's complicated. So Wikipedia, co-created, community-owned. Websites which are official and always available, but only tell part of a story. We've got stereotypes and we've got wisdom, and we have to balance the needs of those two. We've got experts within our community. I've got Sam that I can rely on in some areas, but he wouldn't know much about certain other things, so we have to curate and build our communities to support us. And then we tell our stories. We shape our stories and we share them. Sharing is a differentiating behaviour in the social age. Who's got a blog? Who writes a blog? Loads of people write blogs. Why do we write blogs? To tell our story, to work out loud, to narrate our learning. I'm really interested in this idea of storytelling, how we shape and share our stories over time and chart our learning as we go. And this is the social age. I draw this map every 6 months or so and redraw it. This is just a snapshot of part of this evolved reality that we live in. And I use that term evolved deliberately because evolution is about response to environment. As environmental pressures change, only those individuals and organisations and entities which are able to adapt are able to survive and to thrive. And the social age sees some really broad trends which impact heavily on how organisations operate. All of these slides are online, by the way, and I'll put the presentation on SlideShare afterwards. Social collaborative technology is, of course, everywhere. It connects us, and it empowers us, and it democratizes us. So it used to be the case that everything was limited by distance, by geography, and by technology. You get local architectural styles because people didn't travel far. And then we put railways in so that we could ship bricks around the country, and then we had brick buildings everywhere. And now, of course, we get ubiquitous glass and steel skyscrapers that are everywhere around the world because communication lets that happen. But of course, today, I can't telephone somebody in North Korea, not because of the technology, but because of the political will that blocks it. The barriers to communication and collaboration are now the ones that we impose ourselves, rather than the ones that are imposed by geography. In a globalized world connected by social collaborative technology, the barriers to collaboration are the ones that we put in place. We see this devolution of creativity. Who's used GarageBand to make some music? Yeah, loads of people. Well, we've got some blogs, people writing blogs. Filmmaking, who makes films? Yeah, you see, it's easy. It's easy for us to do. The GoPro, which is a brilliant bit of kit, what does it cost, £250 now? Shoots full cinema quality video, and anybody can do it. When in my last business, we were setting up the e-learning team, they spent £25,000 on the camera. And then they came back to me and said, we need £10,000 for the lens. It's like, you buy a camera without a lens. But we also see these differences. The social contract is fractured between organisations and individuals. This fundamental bond of trust which says, if you give me your all, if you commit yourself to giving your time and your energy and your effort to the organisation, we will reward you with salary, with security, with development. But of course, the world changes much faster now. There is no such thing as a job for life anymore. There's a portfolio of jobs, and you're in charge. It's you and your community around you. We see a much greater desire for social responsibility, a need to be responsible for what we do, to be accountable. It becomes differentiating because the value of the brand is owned by the community. It's not a case that we can just employ the best people anymore. We have to attract them. Because by investing ourselves within a particular organisation, we're investing something of our integrity, something of ourself. I'm working at the moment with a company in Saudi Arabia, and it caused me anxiety to think about that. How do I want to engage with this organisation? What do I think about their record on human rights, their record on equality and diversity? Do I want to engage to help them change? Or will I suffer attrition against my integrity? Will I be judged by my community for working in that way? And these are significant because if you work in a global organisation that goes across multiple jurisdictions, you're not just crossing geographies when you take that conference call. You're not just crossing oceans. We're crossing legal, moral, and ethical boundaries. So social learning is about communities. It's about tapping into the wisdom of our community. But the ground that we're standing on isn't equal. I can be working with people on one project. I can be in one room. We can all be in one collaborative space, but we're differentiated by notions of what's fair, what's right. I can be working in a team where they will say, I do not want to work with that person who's homosexual because it's illegal and immoral and wrong in my view. And by their definition of right, they're right. It's not my definition of right, but that's our reality. We're separated by it, and we can't assume that some kind of Western liberal colonialism will rule the world, because it won't. We are separated by values of what's right, and we have to be united by respect. And we have to find a way in these spaces in order to operate effectively globally. So I distract myself easily. That was the first time. You can throw things at me if you want to pull me back. Communities are about sense-making. Sense-making is about... it's very hot. I'm taking my hat off. It's about making things relevant. We learn about stuff here. It might be interesting, it might not be interesting. It might be relevant, it might not be relevant. But we find that out in a community. We form our stories, and then we share them, and we tell them as we rehearse them. So when we become effective in a role, we build our own language, we build our own vocabulary. So we're using this at the moment. I'm doing a big onboarding induction program with one of the petrochemical companies, and we're using stories as the root of this, because onboarding isn't about learning where the toilets are and where the coat hooks are. It's about becoming a high-functioning member of the community. It's about your ability to perform your job well, but not just according to rules and processes, according to the tacit knowledge that sits within the organisation. So I've been doing some work with the military in America, and the story that came out was really interesting, is they do this pre-deployment training for 4 weeks before they get deployed. And they come out of this final session literally ready to go. And the sergeant goes up and puts his hand on the shoulder of this young squaddy coming out. And he says, right, what we're going to do now is we're going to go and have a chat about what we're really going to do when we get out there so you don't get us both killed. So he's invested in that tacit knowledge. He recognises inherently that bridge between formal knowledge and lived experience, ground truth. So Some of it is about discarding stuff. We don't have to believe everything we're told, it turns out. We're allowed to make discretionary judgments. And this is what our community helps us do. Communities help us make sense of stuff. Help me make sense of this, because they have snakes in Austin, which I hadn't twigged until I was cycling along and this snake comes out in front of me and I nearly fell off my bike. And so I put it up on Facebook. What's this? I was hoping they'd come back and say it's a water moccasin, which is like a really deadly snake. But it turns out it wasn't. But at the time I thought it was. So, you know, we share stories about my Stetson, because, you know, it engages with our community. We get value out of reinforcing these social bonds. But crucially, I share it on Facebook. I don't share it on Twitter, because Twitter's like my formal space, but Facebook for me is a social space. Who's got 2 phones? Oh, that's a lot of people with 2 phones. Why have you got 2 phones? You know, we tend to have 2 phones because we differentiate what we do with them. So we tend to have a work phone and a social phone, a personal phone. And it's not just about who pays the bill, it's about what we do with it. We actually use different language through different technology. If it's a work phone, we write our emails differently. We use different words. We have different types of communication. We differentiate between these different technologies because we recognize inherently that one is owned by the organization and the other one is owned by us. And that's significant because if we're looking at a social learning approach where we're trying to tie into the wisdom of community, it's not enough to say, here's a great collaborative space that we've just spent £1 million implementing. Please feel free to share all your stories. Because people may engage. So the number 1 challenge is usually to get engagement. But the number 2 challenge, which is by far the bigger one, is to get an authenticity of engagement. Because you need trust to engage. And why would you trust an organization? Not having trust doesn't mean that they're not lovely people, because we all work with lovely people. It just means that they're the people that are going to be doing your performance review. And the performance review is a mechanism not to give you that 1.5% pay rise. So why would you put yourself in a situation where we're sharing all of this information in this space which is owned by the organization, when we could share it in a community where we own the infrastructure? So I'm doing a project at the moment with the senior leadership team in a global business, financial service business, and we're using a community space to do this, to help them define the type of leadership they need going forward. But we're running the conversation in 2 spaces. One is just on LinkedIn in a private forum, and the other is on a piece of quite expensive but very nice social collaborative technology. And they're different conversations. And it's quite significant because the ownership of one sits with the community and the ownership of the other sits with the organization. And it affects the type of conversations that we have. So the good news is people have conversations. The bad news is, as the organization, we can't own them. We are allowed to be in the conversation, but we can't own and control the conversation. The old way was that we wrote our stories. The old approach to a leadership development course would be to write it. You know, come up with it, come up with a syllabus, look at a competency framework, decide what we want our leaders to be like, and then do it to people. In the new world, we publish our stories, and then we write them. We co-create them. If you look at any news site, it evolves constantly in response to feedback, in response to new information. Wikipedia is constantly evolving. Nature is written and then published. There's a fundamental difference between the 2. This is what my friend Kath sent me. She's putting on a festival, folk music festival, and she had to do this 4-week health and safety course. And she just said, you know, I just can't keep thinking how ridiculous it is to have to know this stuff. I'll never need to know it again. It's quite interesting, isn't it? What does knowing stuff mean? It used to give us power and authority and status to know stuff. But we see through the evolution of the medical industry, just knowing stuff isn't enough anymore. It's being able to do something with it that's important. It's that sense-making piece. So the technology is great. You know, we all love technology. Well, I love technology. I don't know. This is a learning technology event, so I assume you all do. It's, you know, we love the technology because it lets us do different things. It lets us communicate. It lets us tell our stories, you know, through Facebook, through Twitter, through LinkedIn. We curate information. It's a big part of social leadership, is curating and sharing the right type of information. We use it to distract ourselves. I'm not the only person that uses it to distract myself. It's a thing that we do. You know, we're just like bored, the tension drops, let's do something. We use it to enhance our performance, to bring us the right information at the right time in the right format. And very, very occasionally, we use it to telephone people with. But usually we're hanging out, or we're Skyping, or we're jiving, or yammering, or tweeting, or LinkedIning, or whatever we're doing. So, we use it to collaborate. The technology facilitates us, but it's not the answer in and of itself. You can't buy a system that will give you social learning and collaboration and engagement, but you can certainly use systems that will facilitate it. Because this is what we're looking for. We're looking for agility. It's an agility in mindset and an agility in behaviors. And agility is about uninhibited curiosity. It's about a permission to question everything. From anybody in the organization, say that thing that we've been doing for so long, do we still really need to be doing it? Because what organizations do is they cage complexity and risk. So they see something that they want to happen, they see some behaviors or some things that aren't happening right, and they try to frame it off. Stop doing this thing over here, stop doing this thing here, stop doing this thing here. And before you know it, you've got a 25-page expenses policy telling you what you can't do. But what happens with that is we do a good job of creating a space where excellence may occur, but we don't necessarily help people to figure out what excellence is. I've been doing some work recently about fairness, and we do a lot of stuff to help leaders and individuals and organizations understand what's unfair. It's unfair to discriminate, but we don't necessarily help them to figure out what does fair mean. Because, of course, it's a broad spectrum space. There are lots of different behaviors that we can exhibit that can still be fair but not be identical. And that's quite an interesting challenge. The thing we know for sure is that if we go up to Canary Wharf and walk into some of the big banks and see these huge letters and things saying honesty and integrity and fairness, that doesn't make you honest and have integrity and be fair. Culture is created in the moment by the behaviors that we exhibit into our communities. That's what we're judged on. My last book was around social leadership, around social authority, contextual and consensual of the community, not formal, positional and hierarchical authority, but the authority that we earn. Because that's key to agility, is to have a reputation that lets your voice be heard. So agility is about doing things and refining, constantly iterating with the support of our community. So then we need to think from a learning perspective, how are we using knowledge? Are we using it to inform people or to control people? Are we using it to get things done and to create transparency? Are we building that tribal capability? If people are effective through their communities, it's not accidental. We have to be supporting that process. We have to facilitate our communities, not try to own our communities. So I'm sharing this slide. Quite a lot of this stuff actually is the first time I've shared. So this is the first time I've shared this slide. And it comes out of a piece of work I'm doing with a global business around their fundamental approach, hooked myself up, their fundamental approach to learning. And this is really 7 aspects of learning that we want them to be considering, whether they're doing compliance training or leadership development or induction, any of these things. And we're not going to go into all of these today, we're going to look at 2 in detail, but it's about learning methodology. It's about having learning which is great because we design it to be great, not by accident. So it's about creating your learning spaces, your rehearsal spaces, and your performance spaces. Scaffolded social learning we'll look at next in a little more detail. It's about how do we actually engineer our learning? How do we design it so that it's effective in this way? So that it ties into the best of the formal approaches to learning and also the best of the social co-creative approaches. How do we use communities? How do we understand where our communities are and how do we facilitate and empower them? And who owns them? That's an interesting thing. Who owns those communities? How we tell stories and how we use stories. I'm very excited because this is the week 3 of a 26-week leadership development program that I've got rolling out in an organization right now which has storytelling at its heart. It actually has a storyteller attached to the group, telling stories on 3 levels. They work with every individual to write their personal narrative of learning. They have a nice moleskin book they can use, or they can use a private blog space, or they can do a video diary. It doesn't matter and I don't care, as long as we know that they are telling that personal story. We then have the co-created community story. So this week we've just published the first magazine written by the group, But interestingly, it's not one magazine. There are 10 different cohorts going through, and every cohort publishes its own magazine in the same narrative structure. It's like having a copy of The Independent with all the stories stripped out, but the spaces are still there, the headlines are still there, but the content is written by each group. Every week, for all 10 cohorts, for 26 weeks. So at the end, they don't go away with a workbook to prop the door open with. They go away with a book they've written themselves. We collate all of that into one book. It's a co-created story. So we have personal narratives of learning. We have co-created stories of learning. But then crucially, we have the organisational narrative that sits on top of it. And that's about how willing the organisation is to read all of those stories and to say, this is the stuff we think is important, but this is the stuff that our community thinks is important. And these are the people who are running the business. So aligning those two into a meta-narrative of the organisation is key. The choreography of learning. You know, learning has to be good. Not just good, it has to be excellent. Because everything else I do in my life is filled by experiences that are excellent. From free apps, from technology, from entertainment. So why would I engage with learning that's not excellent? It has to be excellent by design. From the very first email we send people, to the way they come on courses, to the way they understand the rules, to what they take away, we have to be excellent in it and choreograph it. We have to have the spaces and permissions for this conversation to take place. We have to actively strive to build the trust required. And that takes us into agility. So this is an overall architectural approach. You know, how will we, as an organisation, tackle learning in the social age? So I want to look at two pieces. Both of these are new. You know, first is how we plan, strategic planning for social learning. And then secondly, the scaffolded social piece. So this is a model that I'm using currently with two clients. It's about how we strategically plan and check the health of the environment that we're creating. And it looks at 4 key areas in a healthy and agile organisation. The first is curation, how people bring information in, what sources of information we bring in. The second is engagement, how engaged are people with the whole conversation. The third is about debate rather than argument. So are we actually talking about stuff or arguing about stuff? And the fourth is how we apply it. Because remember right at the start I said it's about being effective. Bless you. It's about, you know, it's about your ability to perform in the moment. So we need to look at these 4 elements. These aren't the only 4 elements, but I've tried to keep this model quite simple. But around the edge, there are facilitating or confounding factors. So technology can facilitate us to curate and share great information, but it can also confound us. It can get in the way of us if it's owned and controlled by the organisation. If our IT department is locking stuff down. If we don't have permissions and trust, we won't engage. Or if we have trust, we won't get into debates. We'll say the things that people want us to say. And if we have application, we have to tell our stories of how we apply it. So curation is an interesting thing. We have to understand how we tackle our approach. As an organisation, moving into the social space, starting to move away from formally defined and applied learning to social learning, we have to think, well, what are we going to do? Are we going to do what the universities did when faced with Wikipedia and say, oh, you can't use that? We need to actually analyse it, look at what people are curating and bringing in. Is everybody bringing in Harvard Business Review articles? Is everybody bringing in particular blog articles? Is your knowledge clustering? And what does that mean for the organisation? Do you have an infrastructural bias? Are you blind to something that's happening in another sector? And that blindness, that willful blindness, is quite significant. So one of the social learning pieces I'm doing with a big engineering company at the moment is about asymmetric competition, which is really about how Uber came along and broke the taxi industry, or how Airbnb came along and is breaking the hotel industry, or how PayPal is breaking the credit card industry. It's about your competitors are not necessarily the people that used to be your competitors. In fact, those people may now be your collaborators. Your competitors are probably the ones that you don't know about yet. They're probably the people who, through ignorance or good luck, are breaking your model. So we have to understand, where's the bias in curation? Where's the bias in the knowledge we bring? We know that we don't have all the answers, but even once we start to open it up, we may still be focusing too much in one area. So we need to explore curation and actively plan for how we're going to facilitate it. And that may include looking at things like copyright issues. We may need to work with people to help them understand how to reference issues, how to reference material properly. And then the technology. Is the technology facilitating or is it blocking? So I've been working with one of the big professional membership bodies around learning, and when we're trying to organise a session, they're like, oh, we can't Skype. We can't Skype because IT won't let us Skype in case we accidentally collaborate and communicate and talk about stuff which is faintly relevant. Who knows? It's a mindset of control. It used to be valid because infrastructure used to be complex and costly and expensive, and organisations wanted to get it right. But now, let's make no mistakes, most IT departments are just operating under an empire-building mechanism of control. They say no because they can say no. What they don't do is say, how can we facilitate you to be excellent? When I was over at Facebook recently, I was asking them about IT. They said, they're great. We love our IT department. They're so good. Imagine that. Who loves their IT department? People love their IT department if their IT department helps them to be excellent. So on the one hand, that's funny, but on the other hand, it's, oh my God, we're working in organisations which are preventing us from being excellent. The future for organisations is to be scaffolded and reconfigurable, to be able to adapt. We need the right frames to understand risk, but we have to create the spaces for experimentation. And I'm deliberately using strong language because when people turn around and try to argue against me, I don't mind because they won't be here in 5 years' time. Just think of all the big organisations we've seen that have failed because they've been unable even to recognise the truck which is bearing down on them. And that's true for many of our industries. The world is changing extremely fast, and it will continue to change. Agility is about the ability to surf on that wave of change. It's not about losing control. It's about exerting a different type of influence, a consensually granted one. It's about providing these spaces for people to at least think about what needs to be done. Engagement, why will people engage? Well, we might say they'll engage because we tell them to engage, and we might say they'll engage because we reward them for engaging, but it's about more than money. If we actually ask people about it, they engage because they're interested in stuff, because they want to be recognised for the expertise they bring. We're doing some really interesting work with Nokia last year around their frontline customer support. And who's got an Android phone? Never mind. You'll notice that that they go wrong when it updates. It requires a little bit more tinkering than other phones when it comes out because they're slightly more open ecosystems. So what happens is when these phones come out, they have people around the world in a first-line customer support community who figure all that stuff out, figure out how to solve all that problem. And if as a user you go to that community and ask for support, that will come from that frontline community. But that community isn't employed by Nokia. They have a small team that facilitates that community of super users. They call them fanboys and geeks. These are the people who take it to bits, figure it out quicker than the engineers at Nokia can do it, and provide that frontline support. And what Nokia do is they provide the support and the framework for that community. So they provide the forum space. So they have a formal forum space where you can go with your inquiries, but they also engage in other spaces. They facilitate the experts in that community to be excellent, and they do that by taking some of those super users, those highly engaged individuals. They give them early access to technology. They give them social recognition and reward. They give them reputation. And that's significant because that's what people want. So it's a different model of how to provide customer service. Generosity is another differentiating behaviour. Sharing, generosity, humility are behaviours which are recognised and rewarded by our communities. Those people that invest in the community, that support others. We shouldn't lose sight of it. So permission is interesting. Permission can be granted by the organisation, but it can also be claimed. Is anybody from the NHS here? Oh, excellent. I've got some people at the back there. So I haven't got my Pride in the NHS badge, which Paul Bromford gave me. I meant to wear that, but I forgot it. But I like that. I wrote about how he was wearing a badge saying Pride in the NHS. Isn't that great, to be proud of what we do? The Healthcare Radical programme in the NHS is one of the best examples of how to give people a permission to explore change. In fact, I think it's the best programme at the moment in the world around this space. It's deliberately called, it uses that term radicals. Healthcare radicals, it gives people a permission to understand how change occurs and to explore how change occurs. I won't have time now to go into it in detail, but I think it's fantastic. The transformation office is only, I think, 11 people strong, but doing great work. Not getting all the answers right, not doing everything, but it's tying into socially moderated models of change. It's very exciting. I'd really encourage you to look into it if you're interested in how to help an organisation strive to be agile by creating a permission and a space to be part of the change. And in fact, I'm using some of those ideas at the moment, again, with a large petrochemical company which is trying to change. And we're running conversations through the whole depth of the organisation about how we can get people at every level engaged in shaping what that change looks like. We co-create the rules, understand who owns those conversations. To get engagement, you have to give permission. So now I'm into the second half of the model. This is newer. I've not written it all yet, because this is how we work. Remember, I don't just write the story and publish it. We work it out as we go along, and we take the feedback as we do it. So this piece, debate, the key about this is the difference between argument and debate. So in online social spaces, we often fall into argument and opinion. What we need to do is to encourage debate in that classical sort of Greek context of can we argue it from both sides. So in a healthy community, we plan to let people have their say and wave their placards, but we also have to learn to argue from both sides. We have to foster the skills for debating things, because that's part of the sense-making thing, but we can't assume that everybody can do that. Often online spaces do polarize into different opinions. So we have to intervene to guide the conversation. And to do that, we need trust. That trust which has to be earned. And the thing I say is that trust between individuals is different between trust between individuals and organisations. So Imogen and I met last week in America. We didn't know each other, but we had a friend in common. So that gives a little bit of a foundation. And we then talk a little bit and we share some stories. And then we had some other colleagues there. We got together. We started to build trust. We start with small, safe stories. And now when we meet again, it's like, oh, we know each other. There's more trust there because we have something of a shared journey together. But that kind of trust is different from the trust that we build in organisations. In organisations, we're looking for a consistency of response over time. So it's no good if the organisation is being brilliant over here and fostering collaboration and giving you all the technology you need and all the creative spaces you need. And over here, it's hammering you for breaching the social media policy. That's no good. You can't have trust in that context. I was working with one of the banks that at least had great clarity. It said you cannot be engaged and identified with this bank in any way on social media. Well, you know, okay, fair or not, at least it was clear. Except when you got into it, they had 9 different Facebook groups they were inviting people to join and be part of and contribute to. That's inconsistent. And you get away with it because it's there. But if you don't know that at some point somebody's going to hammer you with it when it suits them, you can't have trust. So we need to understand, you know, what kind of conversations, how are we dealing with logic and facts and emotions, and what space is there for movement on everybody's part. Remember, learning is co-created in these contexts. So if the organisational view of learning turns out to be wrong, we have to be able to adapt and change. So that model is about half of that stuff is published at the moment. I'm working through the next part at the moment if you're interested in that. We're using that both as a strategic planning tool for organisations moving into this space, and then you can use that as well as a diagnostic for how healthy your communities are. And then this last piece is about the social learning. I wanted to share this model with you. This is a methodology for creating scaffolded social learning. So it's all very well saying, oh yeah, go away and co-create it and stop delivering formal courses. But practically we have to think how to do it. And this is what I'm looking at the moment. It's about just 2 things. We just need 2 things. One is we still have formal learning. So we still have workshops and e-learning and podcasts and videos. Still do all of that stuff. That's the box. But then we have these co-created bubbles. And this is where we do the sense-making activity. It's structured, it's scaffolded. This is a model for scaffolded social learning. The scaffolding is the structure, but within the structure is co-creation. So this builds into a learning design which combines the boxes and the bubbles. It goes from formal to co-creative. So the way we implement this, I'll talk you through this leadership development program. I can't at the moment share the actual course outline with you because it's just prototyping with a client. But what you look at under this type of approach is it's a 26-week program, but only 25% of that material is formal. It's only 25% is actually scripted and written and created. So people are engaging for 2 hours a week in that learning, but only half an hour of it is doing formal learning. The rest is co-created and social. So to give you an example of that, in the week, in that program, week 3 is about competition. I've mentioned this already a little, competition. So the formal part of the learning isn't telling them this is our competitor. It's talking about asymmetric competition and looking at some case studies and examples from around the world. In the scaffolded part of the learning, we go through 4 stages. So first of all, we use a curation type behaviour. We ask them to go out as the community in their cohorts and talk about someone who they think is a competitor. So we've already talked about asymmetric, so we don't want them all to go and say the big and obvious one, but some of them will do anyway. But others will come up with really interesting ones, and 1 or 2 will come up with something quite left field. So the first piece is a curation exercise where they go out and they gather an example of who a competitor may be. The second co-creative behaviour is interpretation. So they come back and explain why they think this is a competitor. And we structure that as well. We provide a scaffolding for that. So is this person competing better because they have better facilities than us, better people than us, different permissions from us, better technology? You know, why are they different? So we do this analysis and we help them go a structured conversation through that. We then change the position of the story and say, if you worked there, what would you do differently from what you're doing here? That's a reflective piece. It's about them understanding. If I had different spaces and permissions, remember back to that learning architecture, the 6th piece I think was spaces and permissions. So if you had a different space and permission, what would you do differently? And that's giving them a permission to explore that, to be unafraid to say, well, if I had that technology and that permission and that great leader and you know, whatever it is, all that money, then I would do this differently. And then the 4th piece is to come back and say, so what can I take out of that? With the community, what can we take out of this analysis we've done of our competitors? So the experience of going through a scaffolded social learning experience is individual. Not everybody looks at all of the formal elements. Not everybody takes part in all of those conversations, but all of those co-created conversations are captured within the narrative that's published each week. And we're tying into that wisdom of the community. So to bridge that gap between formal and social learning, we need to create scaffoldings. We need to adjust the ways we design and deliver our learning. It's not about technology. It's not purely about design, but we have to start with that. Around that formal scaffolding, we provide spaces and permissions for the co-creative piece. So we still can do the stuff we did informal, but we're adding on this entire surrounding layer of social. And we give our permission to communities to conduct those sense-making activities. That's a slide I should have used to talk you through the competition piece. So that's the end of my formal piece, if I've read that clock right. These are some of the books I've got around some of these areas. I've got articles online around all of this, so if you're interested in anything, do by all means drop me a note. That's my contact details. I'm not hard to find online. My mother says I'm very hard to track down, but that's because she's not Googling me. So if you're interested in anything, just drop me a note and mention that thing. And I think we've got time for some questions.
We have indeed. Yeah. Excellent. Brilliant. Thank you, Julian.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's a round of applause.
Thanks, Julian. That was brilliant. I really enjoyed that. Thank you. 26 weeks for a leadership program. How the hell did you convince a management team to do that?
Unbelievable, isn't it? I mean,
Absolutely.
it's unbelievable they let me in the door, and then they signed off on it. They used to do 2 weeks, and now, 26 weeks, including 2 full weeks. 1 week we've just done where we flew them into Dubai, and the second week where we're taking them to China. It's a huge investment. The reason that they did it is because they recognise their business is not sustainable unless they can unlock innovation within the organisation. So one of the languages I've been sort of using recently is the difference between churn and change. And this isn't very clever, but I'll use it anyway. It's this notion that the many organisations tackle a change journey by giving an imperative for change. Then they rush into doing loads of stuff. So you move from intent to awareness to doing a shed load of stuff. 18 months later, you're still doing a shed load of stuff. So, the oil tanker's going like this, you've thrown it into reverse, you've thrown it over, there's a huge amount of splashing and churning and juddering and noise and everyone's excited, and absolutely nothing's changing yet. Because to affect real change, you have to get to this point where people are empowered or disengaged. So the people within the community that pick up on this, the leaders within this group that really engage, that start to write the story, to co-create the story, and then drive that change, will be the leaders who will deliver the growth and sustainability of that business. But there will be people who won't. People who will say, oh, I've seen it all before, we'll sit this one out, thanks. And that's okay. But under this model, their choice is, I'm not going to be in that community anymore. So that story is resonating with them. So that's how we get to it.
I'm interested in the use of the social element and what combination of people you envisage, and whether you see combinations where you don't have a lot of new starters who can form a cohort. How do you deal with someone who needs to be brought on board in that social space where they don't have peers?
Yeah, it's very interesting. So I'm working on two big onboarding programs at the moment. One is in a financial service organisation, which is quite easy. They're 180,000 people, so there's always new people coming on. The other's 45,000 people, and by the time you split it out regionally, what you see is that in the US, they always can muddle together a group. But in Asia, it's sometimes one or two people at a time. So what we're looking to do there is firstly make it highly timely, because even where they're putting people together in a group, some people aren't going through induction, through their onboarding, until nearly 6 months into their role, which is of course insane, because all you're doing is something transactional at that point. So one thing that we're doing is kicking those communities off immediately. In fact, that you can have access to some of that before you even start. So it has to be highly timely and highly relevant. And a key theme that I'm using with them is about changing the stance and tone of voice of storytelling. So what we have to go down is this gradient of formality very rapidly. So when you have your first engagement as an individual going into an online community, it's always inherently formal. But after you've been in your job for 3 days, suddenly your community is telling you far more than that formal induction program is. So we have to change down that gradient of formality in our formal interventions. So we can't design an induction program that runs for 6 weeks that continues to use the same stance and tone of voice for every different element, because by the time you get to day 3, people are off and away, and then it just becomes transactional. So we use the first week to build community, specifically to tie them in with people who volunteer within the communities, be their community leaders and managers. And then we change the formality of the learning very fast. So it still runs for the same amount of time, but it rapidly moves from that formal through to fully social. Again, I can share drop me an email, I'll show you a couple of case studies around that.
Obviously, the first word you put up was effective, and I was just wondering how you go about measuring the effectiveness, especially of the sort of the, not woolly, but the more social aspects when people aren't necessarily doing standard things within that sort of bubble.
Absolutely. So, I mean, measuring it is easy. You measure it. So, and we measure it by a range of factors. So I usually talk about triangulating it. So there's social learning isn't less rigorous than formal learning. It is in fact better, because it's about people being effective. So, it's about not getting shot rather than being shot, which is quite a good quantitative measure of success. So practically what we look at is, one is self-reported learning. So when I talk about personal narrative, you can actually use that as a self-reported measure of learning, which is basically, what am I doing differently than I used to do? So we can do internal, reflective, introspective, self-reported models of learning. We can still do formal assessments, and we can measure that through, for example, scenario-based training. So we put people into a scenario or simulation, and there's a huge amount of this interest in this in military contexts, doing a lot of work around that sort of military simulation piece. But there's also interest in customer service and in healthcare simulations, often facilitated by technology. So we can look at people's ability to perform in realistic environments, and we can measure that. We can then look at peer reviewed measures. So I've been doing some work recently, which I'm going to be presenting in, I think, September, October at DevLearn, which is about game dynamics. So not crappy scoreboards and badges given like that, but community awarded reputational based badges. So we could say, you know, here's a great curator in our community, I'm going to give you the curation badge, and here's somebody that helps make sense of it. This person helps tell our story. This person provides the best new information. This person cross-links better. And you map it out. And then you can literally work with your team to say, well, this is interesting. This is the distribution of skills we have. And it ties into this sort of swarming notion that within a tribe, you need a range of skills. And we can actually start to quantify and look at it and then identify where the weaknesses are. So back in that model where I was looking at curation, you know, we have to think, do we have a bias in what we're doing? Do we have too many people who are in this space and not enough in this space? So we can quantify it. We can use both qualitative and quantitative measures and do so highly effectively. I would argue even more effectively than we do in formal learning because we're able to include the application parts of it. But it's a real challenge. Yeah.
Just, do you see any differences between sort of assessing long-term effectiveness and short-term effectiveness? And over time, it's one of the issues, I actually work in education, one of the issues we have is actually judging in 10 years' time what has been done that's been effective.
It's quite interesting that. So the organisation I'm working with on the leadership development is also the only organisation I've ever worked with that works to a 10-year plan rather than a 3 to 5 year plan. So that notion of long-term view in an age which is pushing us towards reactive development is quite interesting. I wouldn't be optimistic enough to say that's a bigger trend we'll see. But yeah, I mean, obviously measuring effectiveness over time is key. And that comes down to an organisational mindset, which is of procuring and delivering and measuring the effectiveness of projects in isolation, rather than necessarily measuring them in the experience of the whole organisation.
I think it's also the individual's mindset as well, though, because as you're saying, if you're owning your own career, it's actually probably not so much the organisations in that long term, it's actually for the individual to keep their own record and their own stories and actually be able to train them to identify what it is that they're learning from.
And that's why we see spaces like LinkedIn, which let you curate your story and interpret it and tell your story, are so powerful. Because, you know, the research depends which you look at, but in the US, there's a piece out last week saying young people leaving work will have 42 different roles. In the UK, I think it's 28 different roles. So, you hold that story, your reputation, again, that ties into that social leadership piece, it's your reputation in community, which is the reason I'll call you up in 6 years' time and say, hey, I've got an interesting project. That's how it goes. Yeah.
Thank you.
Julian, in Ravensbourne College, one of the things that we've noticed is that there are several transition points where people need to go through again an onboarding experience. For example, when students leave school and they come to the college, it's a completely different learning experience. When they finish their first year and go into their second year, it's a completely different learning experience. And also right at the end, when they leave and go out into industry, again, it's a transition. There's a constant process of onboarding, but also outboarding, what we call induction and abduction. And one of the things I'm just curious about from your experience, you mentioned it partly in terms of changing things from a formal way of learning to a more informal way of learning, which is actually what we do in our inductions. We have formal introduction to the building, health and safety and so on, and then 6 weeks in we do something called an enhancement week, where we teach them more personal, social things that will enable them to learn more effectively. And I'm just curious, from your perspective, I know you mentioned about onboarding, but have you had to also manage transitions where people are leaving from one area and going into another, and you have to manage outboarding and inboarding together? How do you do that? Yeah,
it's very interesting. So the model I'm typically using around this, which really ties into how we affect change in the organisation, is it's very easy for organisations to slip into us and them, into saying, you know, these people don't want to change, these are the problem. But in fact, it's people who are invested in the status quo because we invested in them. You know, we reward them for being high functioning in this space. So a model of change to get people to move to be effective in the next space, either as a learner, leader, or whatever, is about letting them shape partly what that new space looks like so that people are emotionally invested in the success of the new piece. So very often we fall into transactional models of movement. It's fascinating. I was working with a law company at the moment. It's small, they're 300 people, and they've acquired a couple of other companies. And they've got a lovely brand. They've got really nice branding. They've put a lot of time and effort and energy into doing this. And so they're rolling it out across across the other organisations. But of course, when they say rolling out, what's perceived is the Third Reich rolling through Poland. You know, this is what's seen as coming as the juggernaut of change, as embodied by the new paint scheme and people coming in and ripping out your computer. And it fails to account for nesting behaviours. You know, people want to. And when you actually go through and look at them, run some workshops with them about where they find their pride, one of those officers said, we find our pride in the fact that our walls are scarred and damaged, and this is a working environment. It's not this type of environment. So we have to understand these sort of different layers. Change isn't just about knowledge and skills. It's about self-definition, reputation and such like. So it's a complicated area, but I like that. I mean, the way you're using those terms, inboarding and outboarding, is neat, and how we can bridge those gaps with storytelling, and perhaps tying into some of these notions, as the NHS has started to, about pride. You know, how do people find pride? Where do they think they'll find their pride? How do we give them the chance to invest it in new areas? Very interesting challenge. Yes.
Fantastic. Well, I'm sorry to say that that time is up. Absolutely brilliant, Julian, as ever. Thank you.